Kia ora, e nā rorangatira mā, nau mai haere mai whakatoa mai ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coates aho, ko te kaiarahi o te putea whai whakaro. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening all. I'm Barry Coates, founder and CEO of Mindful Money. A warm welcome to you all. This is the start of Mindful Money's second online seminar series. We initiated the first series in the early days of our first COVID lockdown. And hopefully this series is in the last days of the final lockdown. We welcome your questions during the seminar using the Q&A button, and there'll be information on the issues we're talking about in the chat function. So to kick off our series, I'm pleased firstly to welcome via video the film director, author and activist Richard Curtis. You may have seen his films. They include Four Weddings and a Funeral, Love Actually, Bridget Jones' Diary, Mr. Bean, Blackadder. But Richard's also an activist. He's founder of Mindful Money's UK ally, Make My Money Matter, which is making pensions healthy for people on the planet. Richard's currently in LA and can't join us now, so here's his video.
I'm so honoured and delighted to be here today. I was born in Wellington, but left young, and my only real memories from then are the words Lower Hut, where we lived, and Hokey Pokey, which was my favourite flavour of ice cream. I'm also slightly surprised, obviously, to be here with you as well, as I'm sure you are. Surprised that the writer of Mr. Bean and Love Actually and Notting Hill, the man who made Hugh Grant so rich and so unhappy, is so passionate about the role of finance, and in my case, especially superannuations and pensions. But in fact, it's extremely logical. I've spent 30 years trying in my small way to find ways to fight the great inequalities and injustices of the world. And my first step was through charity, when I founded Red Nose Day, which I still hugely believe in. But then in 2005, with the Live Aid Concerts and Make Poverty History, I changed my focus to try to put pressure on governments to do all they can. But the world is changing. This has been such an extraordinary year because of COVID, but also with the rise of the very strong public movements around the world, like Black Lives Matter, Fridays for the Future, and the Me Too movement, and the women's marches. And increasingly, I noticed my children saying, what can I actually do in my daily life with my own resources to make changes? And then I listened to a TED talk by an Australian cancer doctor, Bronwyn King, who discovered that a lot of her money was invested in tobacco companies. She'd actually been killing more people with her investments than she'd been saving with every day of her life's work. And for the first time, I asked myself, what's my money doing? Especially, what's my superannuation doing? I'm not sure I even knew that it was invested. And the more I looked into it, the more exciting a line of action and thought this seemed. Here's the biggest chunk of my money, and it may be directly contradicting the things that I believe in and the things I work for. And more than that, think about the good that money could be doing if it was rightly applied, the exciting things that it could be invested in, from wind farms to affordable housing, from affordable healthcare to green cement. And it's been an extraordinary journey since then. I found out the astonishing scale and size of pension pots around the world. That's 50 trillion globally and around 2.7 trillion in the UK alone. Then I got scared, but wait, is this one of those luxurious things where it's money versus morals, value versus values? And would the campaign be asking people to make financial sacrifices in order to do the right thing? But I became interested in exactly the moment when it was becoming clear that sustainable investments were actually making equal and often greater profits than old-style pensions. I've heard the governor of the Bank of England describe sustainability as the biggest investment opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. And that's the reason we set up a campaign called Make My Money Matter, to tell the public that their money could be creating the world they want. And what's the purpose of inheriting a superannuation in a world on fire? Since then, everything's moved very fast. The strength of the situation is that it is not, as I originally feared, sort of combative. And in the past 2 years, over 30 UK pension schemes with some 40 million pension pots and nearly 800 billion in assets have committed to net zero. And business is on the journey too. Over 60 organizations have now signed up to our Green Pensions Charter, joining the call for a net zero pensions industry. So I'm incredibly impressed by the existence of these seminars, which are going to, I know, range far and wide. And I hope you have a tremendous time. And my message to all of you is this: you are the necessary heroes of the hour. You're not bystanders for climate change and inequality as they rage around us. You're the people who can take action when the world needs action so urgently. With the COP coming up in Glasgow and the halfway point of the Sustainable Development Goals approaching, this is precisely the moment to accelerate change in the direction that the public wants it and the world needs. Climate commitments are particularly urgent. Someone said this week to me, a thing that I've really remembered and struck a chord: weather always used to be the last thing on the news, and now it's the first thing, and the news is not good. The people involved in these seminars are in the privileged position of actually being able to do something about that urgently. You can be key players in creating a world of hope for our families and our children and the planet and its people as a whole. So thank you very much indeed for asking me, and have a good time, and save some hokey pokey for me when I next drop by. Thank you.
So you heard Richard Curtis, save that hokey pokey, but also go and visit Mindful Money's website. We're doing a campaign in New Zealand on these issues, ways that you can use your KiwiSaver funds, your investment funds, to do good rather than your money being used for things that make you very unhappy. And we've got this seminar series coming up, including Richard was talking about net zero commitments by funds. We're talking about that in a couple of weeks' time, and in fact a little bit next week as well. So more about that later, but first, the main act for tonight is to extend a very warm welcome to Honourable James Shaw. James, thank you very much for fitting us into your extremely busy pre-COP26, pre-climate summit schedule. I was telling James that I've seen him on 2 video sessions today about climate disclosures, so I know how busy he is, and we're very grateful for you joining us. For those who may not know, James is, of course, our Minister for Climate Change, Associate Minister for the Environment, co-leader of the Green Party, and James' pre-parliamentary career included consulting on sustainable business when he was based in London. But now James is preparing for the crucial climate summit, COP26, which will take place in Glasgow on the 1st to the 12th of November. So let's get straight into it, James. Please set us the scene. The Paris Agreement in 2015 made an impact because there was agreement to a 2050 target. What do you anticipate will be the key issue or agreement that's going to make COP26 into a success that we can rally around?
Well, Tanakwe, Barry, and lovely to see you again, albeit for the third time today. I don't think we've spent this much time together in years, actually. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And welcome everybody to the show. Look, the COP's one of those things where there's so much going on, it's hard to pin down any one particular aspect. But my gut instinct is that one of the things that will be a necessary but insufficient condition for success is the commitment by the developed world to mobilize $100 billion per year of finance to support developing countries through the transition. And there's been a heap of pressure on us over the course of the last 12 months, and increasing the closer we get to COP, to make sure that that commitment is able to be met. And that it's important in its own right. I mean, it's that money will make a real difference to people's lives and to the ability of those countries to adapt and to build their resilience in the face of the effects of climate change. But more importantly, it was that commitment that was sort of central to being able to get the Paris Agreement over the line in the first place. Because under the old Kyoto system, of course, only developed countries, essentially the OECD and a few others, were required to have an emissions reduction target. And under the Paris Agreement, everybody in the world is required to have some kind of nationally determined contribution towards reducing global greenhouse gases. But the quid pro quo was that in order for the developing countries to come on board with that this assistance would be there. And it hasn't been. That $100 billion target has not been met in any year since the Paris Agreement was signed 6 years ago. Closest we got was about a year ago to about 80 billion, so still about 20% short. So I think if we can get to Glasgow and those of us who are in the donor country club can pull that together, that will go a long way to restoring the kind of the trust and rebuilding the consensus upon which the Paris Agreement was founded. And I think if we can do that, then that makes a lot of other things possible. So there are all these other results that we want out of it. But if we can't resolve that fundamental tension at the moment, most of those other things aren't really possible.
Yeah, I remember when we were in Paris in 2015 and that issue of finance for developing countries became crucial. So now you're able to take a package, which is essentially a quadrupling of climate finance. And when I was head of Oxfam, we could only dream that we would get that degree of uplift in climate finance. So congratulations on being able to carry that through to Glasgow. In terms of other issues there's obviously going to be a lot of discussion about carbon credits, and the issue for carbon credits is often around integrity, and obviously under a previous government, the emissions trading scheme was really undermined by cheap credits coming for hot air, and it really created a problem of the integrity of action on climate change. You're going to be negotiating a successor to that carbon credit agreement. What do you see the prospects of having a really strong system with integrity out of the negotiations?
Yeah, so Barry, this is what's called the Article 6 negotiations. It's only Paris nerds who actually know what Article 6 means, but it is the rules which would enable a more kind of comprehensive multilateral system for, I'm just going to call countries working together to reduce global emissions. And I actually chaired the negotiations for 2 years running at the previous two COPs, and we didn't get that over the line. And this issue of around environmental integrity and transparency was at the heart of the disputes that meant that we couldn't form an agreement on it. New Zealand was particularly badly burned under the Kyoto Protocol system for the reasons that you've outlined. And so we took quite a strong stand that it was better to have no deal than a bad deal. Because we cannot afford as a planet to have a repeat of what happened during in particular the 2000s under that old system. And there are countries, that are take the opposing view and would rather kind of hold up the negotiations because they want to, should we just say, a looser set of rules, which are things that we could never really sign up to. Now, I think everyone's getting quite fed up with the fact that 6 years after Paris, we still haven't landed this. The fact is that the Americans are back in the agreement and they're back talking to the Chinese despite everything else that's going on in that relationship. And so I think, it'll probably land at this COP. And there will be some compromises, and some of those compromises will mean that we probably can't participate in it fully or for a period of time until that kind of stuff washes through the system. because we won't, we won't be keen on where some of those things land. I think that's probably as good an outcome as we're likely to get, but I don't think it would be a tragedy. I just think it's one of those things where it'll be messy and there'll be some compromises. But I think that there's a significant group of countries that will be able to kind of navigate around that, if you like. And I'm pleased that New Zealand is one of those countries.
I know you've been trying to convince your cabinet colleagues that the best answer is really strong domestic action rather than having to resort to carbon credits. But you're also looking to increase our target into the negotiations, nationally determined contribution, or NDC. Do you see that New Zealand's going to come under a lot of pressure to raise our target significantly, and because already there's quite a lot of stuff out there in the public domain in a way that there hasn't been before about New Zealand needing to pull its weight?
Well, I don't think we're going to come under pressure. I think we are under pressure, and we've been under pressure for some time. And there are a number of fairly significant countries that have been putting phone calls through, whether it's the United Kingdom, the European Union, various EU member states, the Canadians, the Americans, the Germans. It's kind of all on. And at one level, that's great, right? Because it kind of shows a concerted effort by some of the most significant economies in the world to lift the global game. So that's good. Obviously, Cabinet hasn't yet made a decision on this, and will soon, before COP, obviously. I don't know whether we'll be able to announce the changed NDC at or before. That's still to be determined. But in reference to your introductory comments about the extent to which New Zealand will rely on working with other countries, even if we left our nationally determined contribution the same as it was lodged by the previous national government in 2016, we would still, even with all of the effort that we're putting into trying to transform the domestic economy, we would still be reliant on working with other countries to meet that commitment. And that is a function of the fact that over the last 30 years, we have comprehensively failed to bring down our greenhouse gases as a nation. In fact, they've gone up rather than down in that period of time. So we're now at this kind of horrendous situation with only kind of 9 years to go, where our starting point is so high, and the economy and our industries and our people and our communities and so on will only be able to move at a certain pace in that 9-year period. And you can get a pretty good assessment of that from the Climate Change Commission's report last May. They said, well, here's what we think, at quite a shove, here's what we think is possible in the coming 10 years. And that falls short, even where our existing target is. And the Commission also found that the existing target is not consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. So we're going to have to lift it up. So there's the conundrum that we face. That's the underlying tension, which is, of course, we want to increase our commitment to our contribution to the global effort. And every percentage point that we increase it above the existing one means that we're increasingly reliant on, agreements with other countries that currently don't exist. Yeah. And so it's a bugger of a problem, to tell you the honest truth.
So a lot of our audience here tonight are associated with the finance industry in some way. Either they work for them, they're engaged in finance through having KiwiSaver funds or investment funds. And one of the things that is starting to happen internationally is that investment is starting to get it on becoming part of the solution rather than part of the problem. What kind of outcomes do you see from COP26, which might kind of accelerate that whole process of driving down emissions through the power of money and the power of investment?
Yeah, look, there's a huge amount going on there. And one of the things that's really fascinated me over the course of the last 12 months in particular is coalitions of finance ministers, coalitions of central banks, coalitions of stock exchanges, coalitions of investment houses in particular, who are kind of rallying around the necessity of that 1.5 degree threshold, and essentially starting to build a new, global financial system, a sort of post, the green Bretton Woods, if you like, seems to be emerging, but without everybody getting together at Bretton Woods. So it's not kind of centrally coordinated that I can tell. There are these kind of initiatives in these groups, but there's actually a remarkable coherence in the direction between them, even though they are kind of quasi-spontaneous. So it's actually one of the areas where I'm feeling most optimistic is this mobilization of capital. And the main problem, and we certainly see that here in New Zealand, it's not the availability of capital, it's the availability of projects that capital can be deployed into. And so, there is a response in the marketplace when capital is available for something. People will tend to work out ways of spending it and putting that to good use. But that to me is sort of my sense of where things are going at the global scale as well.
Yeah. So one of the drivers of those projects for using capital is having a decent carbon price. And of course, regulation and government framework that you're putting in place under the emissions reduction plan. So do you see anything out of Glasgow helping to, in a way, form consensus or greater harmonisation around a carbon price? Because otherwise, we're going to see trading wars. We're going to see a new kind of tension emerging between countries around differential carbon pricing and differential climate action.
Well, to some extent, that tension already exists, right? So we see it here in New Zealand with our emissions trading scheme. We have to give away gargantuan amounts of free units in order to essentially shield our domestic producers from the fact that their competing companies in other countries are not exposed to the same carbon price that our companies are exposed to here. So that's how that equalization gets handled, and it's tremendously inefficient, right? It's a kind of a terrible way of doing it, but it's the only way that we've had available to us up until recently, when the European Union decided it was going to go down the route of having what they call carbon border adjustments, which is essentially a tariff regime, which is kind of the theory is that, if you're a country that doesn't impose a carbon price on production and you're importing goods into my country, and I do, then I should have the right to kind of equalize that at the border in some way. It's an astonishingly difficult thing to do, which is why it hasn't happened before. But the EU are it's happening, and it's happening quite quickly. So, and it'll probably be pretty rough and ready for starters. But you can see that it will get more sophisticated over time. And the fact that the EU are moving on it has meant that the Americans are moving on it, the Canadians are moving on it, and others are starting to go, oh, well, actually, maybe this is a thing. And of course, what that does is it starts to give you the framework for a global carbon price. Because, at the moment, for example, New Zealand, in the basket of carbon prices, we're roughly in the middle. We're currently at 65 New Zealand dollars a tonne. I think that the UK is sitting at about 140 New Zealand dollars a tonne. California's sitting at about $35, $36 a tonne. And so, even for countries that have got any carbon price, there's wild variability between us. And so, if you start to have these kind of carbon border adjustments between trading partners, then, by definition, they'll start to converge on some kind of price or a range or something like that.
Which would be a good thing, right?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then a lot of other things become possible after that. Now, I have to say, we're only at the very, very, very start of that trend. But you know how trends go; they can be a bit of a hockey stick curve. So if you're not careful, we'll see how that one plays out.
And particularly with the Europeans kicking the process along very quickly, as you say. The previous trade minister in New Zealand was rather enthusiastic about countervailing measures, but I sense that New Zealand's slightly become a little bit less enthusiastic. Is that correct?
No. What we've said to the Europeans is the only thing that we're concerned about, particularly given some of the European predilections around these things, is that it shouldn't be used as an excuse for something else. Right, so it shouldn't become a non-trade tariff,
non-tariff barrier.
Yeah, sorry, and that it needs to be WTO compliant. But if it can be those things, if it is literally just about creating a level playing field, then it's actually quite a good idea and quite a useful contribution. It's almost impossible for a country like New Zealand to do by itself. Because we're so small, but for a market the size of the EU, encompassing 27 sovereign states, that if they can move on it, it becomes a lot easier for a country like New Zealand to sort of dock in alongside that type of regime.
Yeah. So if that's a sort of perhaps a force to try and harmonise a carbon price, no doubt there are other things that are going to be able to push us along the road. And obviously today the climate disclosure draft, a consultation draft was launched from the External Reporting Board, and the legislation's going quickly through Parliament. Are you surprised by the reaction to that? It's been enthusiastic support from the finance sector and from business sector more generally.
Well, it was when we consulted on it during the last term of Parliament under a different governmental configuration. I was surprised that I was even allowed to ask the question. But then the feedback that we got, I think I mentioned it on the call this afternoon, was that from the business community, 86% of the business submitters in that consultation wanted a mandatory regime. And the reason for that is quite clearly because people actually do perceive this as a material risk, but also perceive risk in being the only one to report externally on that, and want to make sure that, if I'm going to air my kind of dirty linen, then I want to make sure that my competitors are also doing the same thing, and that we're doing so to a common standard. So the kind of logic of a mandatory regime, is sort of inescapable. But it was great to see the level of enthusiasm from the private sector for that. So that's been good. It's also been good. The opposition have been supporting the legislation through the House, which gives some confidence to the business community that will, remain in place. Like any good opposition, they've raised certain challenges that the government's had to respond to. In a rare and beautiful thing, the Select Committee also made some changes to the legislation, which meant that the submissions that people made actually did kind of make sense and have been picked up. So I think where we're going to get to with that is a really good result in what is actually quite a short period of time. And you can already see, of course, people are starting to try and build capability and capacity to kind of go, okay, well, how are we going to do these things? And we've had a ton of international interest because there's a lot of countries that are looking at this, and I think they're greatly relieved that there is a country that has kind of gone first, that they can say, okay, well, where did you guys land? What can we learn from that?
So when you come back from Glasgow, you're going to have a few things to deal with the emissions reduction plan. Are you looking forward to that whole process? Because from the draft discussion document, there's a lot to do on it, and
Yes.
maybe transport sector was a little fleshed out. Most of the rest wasn't. You're anticipating a fair response from members of the public and business around this?
We had over 1,000 submissions by the end of the day that we launched the consultation document. So, we know that there's a level of enthusiasm and engagement. I also know that people are thoroughly sick of being consulted on essentially the same type of questions. And so that's been a theme of the feedback. And, as I said last week, it's not the only input into that emissions reduction plan. So I know it was a lumpy product that we put out there, but some of the other lumps, if you like, are taken care of in other areas. But, capability within the public service for rapidly decarbonising the economy is pretty new as well. And it's unevenly distributed between agencies. And so because this is the first time that we've done this exercise, required under the Zero Carbon Act now, so it is a mandatory requirement on government, but it is the first time that we've been through this cycle, and so you can see that there is a risk that the final product will be lumpy as well, but it wouldn't be surprising, I guess, because I think we've got something like 15 different Crown agencies who are contributing, and you've got policy advice going up to, at least as many ministers, if not more. And so it's a tremendously complex challenge, and it is burning a hole in the side of my stomach. But half the cabinet, actually.
Yeah. Hey, just before we finish, James. So you're walking down the corridor in Glasgow, cavernous conference rooms, and all around. Who are you looking forward to coming down the corridor towards you and meeting and greeting and spending time with?
Barry, that's a really good question. And of course, my answer is going to portray favoritism. So I'll probably pick a couple of people or groups of people. It's been a very long time since we had the Pacific Island heads of government and heads of delegation in a room. And because of COVID and everything, not everybody can make it. So it's a real shame. Fiame from Samoa, the new Prime Minister of Samoa, is not going to be able to make it because obviously she's still trying to, get things back on the road in Samoa. And she's not the only one who's not going to be there, but there will be a number who are. And so it'll be good for us, I think, as a group to be able to sit down and go, okay, where are things at? What needs to happen? Because it's been a couple of years since we were able to get in a room together like that. I've got a lot of time for Jonathan Wilkinson, who's the Canadian Environment and Climate Change Minister, and they've been doing a tremendous amount of work in Canada, which actually mirrors the work that we did on the Zero Carbon Act here a couple of years ago, and we've been swapping a lot of notes. But because Canada's one of the big countries in the world, they're kind of part of the G20 group that are trying to get the show back on the road, and so they're able to do things that New Zealand's not able to do. But the fact is that we're able to kind of walk with them and put some effort in there. So looking forward to that. And just to be mildly political about it, I'm also quite looking forward to meeting the two new Green ministers in the government of Scotland. Scotland, of course, are the hosts of COP26. And the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Greens have just entered a cooperation agreement, which was modelled on the agreement that we have here with Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party. And we provided we had some great phone calls with them after the election and sort of shared our experience and so on. And it'll be lovely to actually be able to get into a room together and see how things are going.
Great. And anyone who, when you see them come down the corridor, you're going to take off in the other direction?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Maybe Donald Trump if he turns up.
He is not going to be there, and he wouldn't get a pass.
James, thank you very much for joining us on this. We're very grateful for your time and your leadership on climate change. The world will be watching you as you try and persuade other ministers to ramp up climate action and try and corral Cabinet to do so here. So kia kaha as you go.
Thank you. And Barry, thanks for all the work that you've done to help shift things in the financial sector here in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. It's working.
Thank you, James. Yeah, no, I'm feeling really positive about where it's going and how Mindful Money is tracking. So I appreciate that. Thank you. To all our listeners, thank you or viewers, thank you for joining us. We've got some sponsors for this event. I'd like to say particular thanks to AMP, to Booster, Generate KiwiSaver, Harbour Asset Management, and PwC. So for our audience, next week, we're looking at how your KiwiSaver or your investment funds can become a force to reduce emissions. So a lot of people don't quite make the connection for how actually you can use your investment in order to make a contribution to exactly what we've been talking about tonight, which is reducing emissions. So join us next week, 7:30 p.m, Wednesday, 27th of October. You can register by clicking on the button below, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to do it before we finish the seminar. James, thank you so much again. Really always a pleasure, and we look forward to hearing from interesting things that are happening in COP26.
Thanks, Barry. Cheers.